What question should one ask about Cedric today? Oh, there's so many, but I'll start just with one, is the mode of thinking, what architecture does. And architecture is also about questioning the society in which we live, and it is also about inventing questions and providing potential answers. Cedric did it in an extraordinary manner, and I'm still, 50 years later, I'm still interested in this. At the same time, something else has happened today, which is not necessarily for the better, which is the over-reliance to simply hyper-realist images, which go exactly against the thinking. And so this question of finding a mode of notation that allows you to develop an argument, and as opposed to finding simply hyper-realist renderings that provide the supposed answers to questions that were never asked, I think that's perhaps one of the questions that is being raised by this discussion that we have, about Cedric these days. Mm-hmm. As you know, I was always quite interested in what Cedric was doing already at the time, and yes, indeed, it has had an influence, and probably still now in some sort of a way. Namely, that the architect is there, yes, to ask questions, not necessarily to provide any answer that can satisfy, the market or a particular client. It's really looking at society as it is and seeing opportunities for invention. I'll take two projects that we all know, the Fun Palace or the Pottery Think Belt. In themselves, they are not a burning need for the society at the time. Nobody was thinking about it, but it was there. And the potential that was raised thanks to asking these questions was enormous and had an influence that did reverberate, for 20, 30 years after that. I found a profoundly, let's say, introspective person that was simultaneously constantly walking on a tightrope. In other words, when he would give lectures, now in public, the mode of lecturing, which if you've ever tried, of using individual cards which have statements and shuffling the cards in any possible order, and then trying to develop an argument out of the random appearance of each of those questions or comments, is not an easy thing to do. It requires an agility of the mind which he possessed to a great degree. So when he was working around certain theme that I was familiar with, it was certainly an easy, dialogue. But when he was taking other courses of conversation, such as cooking or things of this sort, then he would get me completely lost. Cedric's most significant project, I would say the project of his life, i.e. trying to construct architecture as a form of philosophical endeavor, as a form of research, and I would use, in my own words, as a form of knowledge, and not simply as knowledge of form. After that, we can go and look at a series of individual projects, and we can, depending on the context in which we operate, we can say this, or that. But I think the larger issue is rather considering that architecture can be something more than simply the answer to one specific, question. Well, the history of architecture is filled with people who had a lot of influence and built little. Take Piranesi, for example. Major influence. Take Boulet, Ledoux, and Lequeux, three of the so-called utopian socialists in France. Enormous influence. Take at the time of the same period as Cedric was active, people like, take Virilio and Parent with the oblique function, that's later on. Jonna Friedman, for example. So you have many people who had an influence beyond the act of building, and I would say that even a lesson to learn about what architecture is. Architecture is a mode of thinking and not only a mode of building. And I think this is really important, and there are some cultures and some natures that refuse the idea that architecture is a mode of thinking. I remember one famous Cedric Price architect saying that at the end all the writing disappears, only the building remains. I might want to argue the opposite. Even though I think both of them, the building and the writing, tend to reinforce one another, and that's probably what makes it the most interesting. I think if the opportunity had arisen for him to build more than he has, I think he would have seized upon the opportunity. The reason is that building actually helps you phrase further questions, right? In my particular case, I've always found fascinating the back and forth between not only theory and practice, but between certain way to raise questions, certain way to answers, which are not the only ones. And then that bouncing from the real to the virtual, from the real to the totally theoretical, is an incredibly powerful mode of doing things, right? So I think that it would have been good for Cedric, to find himself in the situation of having, the shoes in the mud and raising other questions. I won the competition of the Parc de la Villette, and at the time, at the beginning of the competition, I won it as a master plan. In other words, I was to organize not only some of my own building, but have also other buildings of people who would join us. So I started to invite some of my friends, and there was John Haydock, there was Peter Eisenman that I paired with Jacques Derrida, and there was, of course, Cedric. And Cedric was very excited about the idea of doing it. He was very supportive of my project. So everything seems to go well. However, it was also a time when money was getting short. And the government was changing. It was an extremely complicated affair. And at the time, it had been said that it should be something which is now familiar to our ears, a PPP, a public-private partnership between the people who would sponsor the building that I had asked Cedric to work on. What I had asked Cedric to work on was a greenhouse. And that greenhouse had to be financed simultaneously by a large horticultural, not quite multinational corporation, but a large operator selling seeds and trees and things of this sort. So Cedric designed, actually, if I remember correctly, 2 schemes for a site that I had given him. The principle was there were the grid of follies, and then you would attach to each of the follies one of those buildings done by another architect. So in the case of Cedric's greenhouse, it was actually quite beautiful, very straightforward. It was a half cylinder with activities happening at different levels within it. In many ways, sometimes I say laughingly that the zoo here in Paris, I just finished the Paris Zoo a few months ago, that the greenhouse has some bit of an homage to Cedric in its simplicity. Unfortunately, back to La Villette, the arrangement between the person or the company that was supposed to finance Cedric project and the park could never be finalized, and the project never went beyond, call it design development. One thing which is very clear about the scene that anybody would enter arriving in London in, say, 1970, 1971. Most schools of architecture used to have a very clear idea of what architecture was. It was directly a reflection, almost a mirror image of what was happening in practice. Practice and the whole history of the modern movement was dictating what was happening in the school. You were learning in the schools what practice had done before you. Arriving in London at that time, suddenly, or maybe not in London, maybe at the A, suddenly it was something which was completely the reverse, where the students were asked to write the program. The students were asked to write the assignments. In the diploma school for a year, they struggled trying to find what will we do, what do we propose. To me, that was absolutely fantastic, because that was completely reversing the logic, which is still like, similar in a lot of places. The architect provides services that are required by the client. In the case of the A, that was the other way around. The architect was to determine what were the needs of society. And now you realize that that was exactly in sync with what Cedric was doing. But ultimately, you could say, and some people might disagree, but you might say that Archigram, when they were designing walking cities or plugging cities or instant cities, were also suggesting what society might need or want. So there was a spirit of invention which was putting the responsibility back onto the architect, rather than saying, oh, we do what we're being asked. And I think this is important, and that's something which is still, I do believe, valid today. If one was to ask oneself today whether this spirit is still alive, I would say yes, it's up to you entirely, and there are, fortunately, a number of architects who will redefine the question that has been asked to them. There are a number of architects who will say, hey, there is this which you need to look into, which has to do with, of course, overpopulation, with global warming, etc., etc. So, in other words, the questions are always there. Many architects are highly responsible. It's society itself that has perhaps forgotten to ask the questions. Today, you have, if you want to build, you're playing a double game. Let me give you an anecdote which has nothing to do but everything to do with our discussion. It's an invented anecdote. When Albert Einstein, walks down my street in New York City 20 years or 40 years from now, when there was a lot of mugging, a mugger takes his gun and points the gun at the head of Albert Einstein and asks him, what time is it? Is Einstein going to give him the theory of relativity? No, he tells him what time it is. Nevertheless, what he really does is the theory of relativity. I think we find ourselves as architects always in this predicament. We're talking in 2014, and the amount of recycling of Cedric, which I see, and what the French call recuperation, using Cedric in every possible means to justify things which are absolutely not worth it. I would be very, very cautious at this sort of refashionable packaging of Cedric Price. I think there's a raw strength and how can I say, I was almost going to use the word honesty in the work, and it is often I see it used by people who use it shamelessly for purely commercial purposes. Well, generally, when you teach, when you talk to students, you're trying to make them understand that architecture is a mode of thinking. And therefore, you use a set of examples. Amusingly enough, the period between, say, 1965 and 1975, 1980, was perhaps for political reason, certainly for political reason, certainly for economic reason. There was not very much work. There was the whole question that went around the 68 period. There was the disenchantment in relationship to the modernist ideals, and the disenchantment in relationship to what was proposed instead, in other words, historicist postmodernism. Hence, the idea of trying to reinvent another world from other, from another point of view was important. And I'll end with my, my first point, which had to do with the mode of notations. The language, the way you write the question, the way you do those diagrams, the way you do those small cartoons, it's a way to come to the heart of the ideas. It is not simply to do those great, blue skies and those lovely people running among the flowers. I was one of the students' representative at the ETH in Zurich. That was somewhere around 67, I suspect. And we were asked to suggest the name of lecturers. And I was a little familiar. I had read, some of the magazine, Architectural Design, AD, and so on. And I was really interested in hearing Cedric come. So I asked my professors, and they said, no way, this is not architecture. So to cut a long story short, I succeeded a couple of years later to invite him in an independent venue called the Le Corbusier Pavilion in Zurich. But meanwhile, I got to know Cedric. I went to see him several times in London, and eventually was interested and to start to work for him. He actually offered me a job, provided that the job that he was waiting for would come. It did come, but 3 years later, and by that time I was teaching at the AA and I was already doing my own work. It was a little late. But that meant that a very different attitude was made available, to someone like myself, who had been until then being educated in a very solid manner, but in a way which was far more traditional than the role of the architect asking the questions as opposed to the architect answering the question.
So industry